I
We are
mean,
busted today, let me tell
we are,
you.
man, I slept the wrong way. I just cannot get this little crook out of my little neck back area.
That is the worst, honestly.
It is, because sometimes it lasts a couple days,
Yeah.
but that's
When
okay.
you're old and you move slightly wrong and now you can't do anything for days.
Right. It's like when you get older, there's a right and a wrong way to sleep.
Right or wrong way to get out of a chair.
Basically. But the morning was lovely. I sat on the porch and drank my coffee, and the air was nice and crisp, and it was a nice hour to myself. It helped
I'm
me.
high on decongestant. I don't know what's happening.
Well, I mean, you're in for a good time.
Am I? It's not
Yes.
fun. I just basically
Yes.
walk around like, ooh.
But aren't you feeling better?
No.
Oh no, not yet. Not yet. It's not working that part yet.
No.
Okay.
So far back in the recesses of my sinuses, it's going to take a long time. Anyway,
Okay.
I have issues. That is not the point of this episode.
All right.
Welcome back. Welcome back.
Hello. Well, I want to
So,
let's get into it. What are you reading, or what have you currently finished?
so I recently finished, and by the time this is up, I think there'll be like a mini review on the channel. But I
Mm-hmm.
recently finished "Can't Spell Tea Without Treason" by Rebecca Thorne, which is in self pub. And if you liked Legends and Lattes and you want more cozy fantasy with like low stakes, this is your book. This was lovely. It's very well written. I know that I think we're coming slowly out of this era of like self pub just kind of being like shitty writing. There's a lot of
Yeah.
really good writers in self pub, so soon I will have to say that it'll just be there and implied. But so basically, you have Reyna and Kyanthi is like this super powerful mage, and Reyna is the like a palace guard for this queen who's kind of crazy, and they have like a secret love affair that's going on. Like the queen
Yeah.
really wants the mage to like be at everywhere. Like she really wants to have a relationship with the mage, not sexually, but like like politically. And the mage kind
Mm-hmm.
of just doesn't like her, so she doesn't come to things. But it opens with like something happening, and this Reyna finally deciding to just do what the mage and her have always sort of like joked about and just like run away, which is treason, to run away from your post as a palace guard
Yeah.
and just open a tea and bookstore
Mm-hmm.
in like some random place and live out their days as like happy people. But they both have like um in theory jobs that they can't really like run away from.
Yeah.
But especially Reyna. So like Reyna runs away because something happens and she's just kind of like, I can't do this anymore. And so she runs away. The mage meets her. They open this tea and bookstore. And like that part of the book while they're building this tea shop and bookstore is a lot like Legends and Lattes when they're like setting up the store and you start to get all the community involvement and you meet all the people in the community and it's just lovely and sweet and there's lots of magic, there's lots of houseplants, there's lots of um, magical creatures. So there's like a griffin, there's a baby griffin, there's dragons, and there is a whole like mystery quest sort of thing going on. There's some tension um, with the queen potentially coming in and people looking for Reyna and all that stuff. So there is some tension and stuff, but overall it's just like this lovely little story about these two people being able to love each other and having their little relationship, and it's not spicy, it's just cozy, and
Yeah.
I loved it. It just like if you just need something nice, like if you're having a rough time and you just want something nice, read
Yeah.
this. Can't spell treason without tea.
You know how I always take off the last few weeks of the year for my
Mhm.
annual end of year vacation. I would not mind reading that and what is it? Legend and
Legends
Latte.
and
What is it called?
Lattes.
Yeah,
Legends and
those
Lattes.
sounds like two nice little December cozy reads to get
They're
into.
just nice. And Legends and Lattes, it's like everybody's kind of like a magical creature. Um, because you have like orcs and like everybody. And like this is more
Yeah,
like you have some magical creatures, but like your people are human, if that makes sense.
yeah, yeah.
Like your love interests are human. And there's going to be a sequel to this too, which is kind of exciting. So there's
Oh,
going to
that's
be like more.
nice.
And it's just so lovely. And I liked that like it was a healthy relationship a lot of time with like good communication and stuff. I think a lot of times with romantic stories there's
Mm-hmm.
always some unhealthy relationship aspect going on, whether they can't communicate or it's like slightly
Right.
abusive or there's always something there. And don't get me wrong, I do like a good like alpha hole romance with like, you know, if it happened in reality I'd be like, excuse me sir, that's abuse. But like
Yeah,
in a fictional world it's different, but this is sometimes it's just nice to see a portrayal of very healthy relationships because not
that's
everybody gets to
nice.
see one of those. So,
Well, speaking of self-published books, I have a call to a particular group of self-published authors. If you are a grimdark self-published author, please slide into the DMs of TBR Lowdown because I want to check out your stuff. If you are a grimdark reader and you have read some fantastic self-pub grimdark, again, slide into the DMs of TBR Lowdown and let us know what they are
I need
because
more grimdark.
I feel like there's some grimdark in the self-pub world that I am not aware of and I need to be.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Andrew's Wizarding World, if you haven't been watching him over, I think that's what his name is. It's something like that. Andrew Wizard. Those are the two keywords.
I don't think I watch him.
And he reads a lot of fantasy. And I think he has a lot of indie stuff in there too and self pub stuff. So
Okay.
that might be a
Andrew's
good place to
Wizarding
look too.
World.
Yeah. Hmm.
Okay. All right. Okay. Well, I have been reading Sirens and Muses, which you know was on my list of anticipated reads. And I
Hmm.
gotta say, I'm really enjoying it. We follow four artists who were in this very elite New York art school. And we're getting a really good glimpse of what it's like to be an art student. We're also getting a glimpse of what it's like to have been like a former artist that was very popular, very in demand, but has somehow lost his way and is now teaching at this very elite private school. So I
Hmm.
like how we're getting a couple of different facets of what it's like to be an artiste, which I'm really drawn to. We're also getting great family backstory of these four art students, which is really playing out into how they're reacting and how they're maneuvering in their world of being a student and an adult. And this is just like one of those just like catnip kind of books that just kind of draws you in to every
Catnip
little
kind of
moment.
books.
It
I
is,
like
it's
that.
like catnip. But
I
I'm
like that.
really enjoying learning about these, budding artists. And I think these characters are pretty well written and I'm fully engaged. So I'm currently on chapter 29, page 268. So I've got under 100 pages to go. So I'll be finishing this probably today, but I'm really, really enjoying it. And I
Excellent.
believe this was a debut, I believe, right?
I
I
think
think
so.
so.
If I'm making any weird faces, Naomi, and or anybody else watching it, it's just because my internet sucks and I can't see you again. So every time I roll my eyes, it's
Oh
not at you,
no.
it's at my internet. Just want to preface that in case
Her
anybody's watching it. It's
internet
like,
does not like her, but I can still see you, so hopefully the recording's
yeah.
good. But
So
anyway,
it says everything's fine, but if you see me rolling my eyes, friends, it's not actually at Naomi. It's
it's
at
at
my
her internet.
shitty internet.
It fails her sometimes and she's not happy about it.
We need to
Anyway,
put
I
in
pick it
so
up, pick it
many
up.
like booster things, but I don't know.
Yeah.
There's
Oh, I
so
didn't
many
say the
projects.
author.
Yes, say the
Hang on. Sirens and Muses by Antonia Angris. Angris? I'm not sure. But, and yet, also another stunning cover.
Oh, the cover is beautiful for that, and I do need to read it. You know what? It kind of reminds me of a undeconstructed, which would just mean constructed, version of the Sisters cover. Um, oh, where is that book?
Oh, is that the one that's got the pieces of the
Of a face.
faces?
Yeah, there's something about it that reminds me of like I feel like if you like broke it back apart, it could be that cover. I know that they're kind of
Yeah.
different subject matters. Oh, I wish I could show you the book, but I don't know where it's run off to in here. It's in some to be filed pile somewhere.
This is
Um,
this is fantastic though. I'm definitely gonna have to get my own copy. This is from the library, so I'm gonna have to get my own copy. Um, yeah, Sirens and Muses, loving
ah,
it.
I found it. I put it back weirdly. Like I just feel like if almost it feels like if you
Oh
took this
yeah,
back apart, it would be that cover. When I look at them, that's what it reminds me of. Um, anyway, that's probably going to fall down
yeah.
in some ghostly specter. But yeah, so we have something that we're really excited for. We have been talking about our June. Is this June? Our June book
June.
pick, The Women's House of Detention, for a while. I put mine too far away. I don't know why. And saying how at first we struggled to figure out how we would do a live discussion about the book because there's just so much in it. And we decided, you know what we need to do? We need to talk to the author. So today we have finally sat down with Hugh Ryan and had a wonderful interview with him.
Amazing.
We are, I love interviewing authors. I hope we do more of it. And yeah, this was a great discussion, I think.
Yes, Hugh was a joy to discuss his book. It
Mm-hmm.
was it was wonderful. I still on a high, still on a high. It was
We
wonderful.
finished the interview and he left, and in the back room, Naomi just looks at me and goes, "I think I love him."
It's hard not to.
It is. It
So
is. So.
anyway, and enjoy this interview.
All right. Hi. So we're here today to talk to writer, historian, and curator Hugh Ryan. He's the author of When Brooklyn Was Queer and the Women's House of Detention. In 2010, he also founded the Pop-Up Museum of Queer History, a grassroots organization dedicated to helping local communities create engaging exhibitions rooted in their own experience. We are so excited to talk about the Women's House of Detention. And so welcome, Hugh.
Hey, thanks for having me
Welcome!
on.
Yay!
I'm super
It's
excited.
We really are so excited. I went on like a rabbit hole of like your interviews and stuff for preparing for today. And I said this to Naomi that I'm so happy to have you on because I really love seeing creators and authors in particular, obviously, because that's what we do, who want to engage in conversation. They're not just having like a one-sided discourse, like where they put stuff out. You really want to engage with people. And I just like genuinely love that so much.
Oh,
So welcome.
thank you.
Yeah,
I'm
because even
super
when we
excited.
posted, yeah, even when we posted about your book being our book club pick, you made a comment right away and just saying, "Hey, let me know if you have any questions." And I was like, "Well, he's a cool guy." That was really nice.
Oh, that's great to hear. Honestly, the fact that anyone is taking the time to read a book while we're in the middle of like whatever this pre-apocalypse we're living through happens to be,
Mm-hmm.
and then not only that, but like a history book, like I know it's hard sometimes to pick up nonfiction. And so I love every reader. And I love questions. I do my best when people ask me questions because often this is so sad. But often I don't know what's interesting in my own work. I'm interested in like a tiny
Mm,
detail that most people are like, that is not the
yeah.
interesting part. You know, it's like you are so deep
Yeah.
in your own material. So when I talk to people, I actually see so much more about the work than when I just sit in my office by myself.
That's so true. We got wind that your book was coming out maybe like around the March, April time frame. And we were like, we have to choose this as a book club pick. And then we've got to try to get him on so we can interview him. And reading this book was, I have lots of tabs, lots of
Yeah.
notes. The
Oh my
book
God.
It's
was really mind blowing. Also, it took quite a bit of time to finish because number one, you're taking so many notes, but also it was just so much
you needed
information that was
breaks.
so heavy and infuriating and
Hmm.
just causing all of the emotions and all of the feelings. And there were days I was like, you know what, New York State, because they were really just rogering up for all the BS every chance they got. And
Hmm.
it's like, okay, I've had enough of you today. I gotta walk away.
I think that
This
is
book
healthy.
Sometimes
was,
I'm not proud of my
yeah,
state.
this is a must read. I think. I feel like it's a must read. I think everyone
It
should read
really
it.
is.
Thank you. Thank you. I
Yeah.
also had that feeling, I must say. Like, normally, during my research, I love research. It's like my favorite thing to be in the archives and flipping through the
Mm.
files. But there were days where I was like, I cannot read about another sexual assault today. Like, I have to stop, like, for my mental health and go walk around the block
Yeah.
or something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
So why don't you give us a little background, like if there's any extra color you want to add to like who you are, and then also just the House of D, like how did it come about? What is the House of D, et cetera, and then we can like launch into some questions and stuff.
Sure. So I actually don't have a history background directly. I was a women's studies major in college, and then afterwards I was a social worker with homeless LGBTQ youth in New York City. And they actually really helped me to see a different side of queer New York than the one I had learned about either growing up, because I grew up in the suburbs, my family's from the Bronx, or studying women's studies. So that helped clue me into kind of a bigger and broader world of queer history that I didn't know a lot about. And I was interested in it, but I was a writer, and so I got an MFA. But at the same time, I wanted to be studying history. And I thought at first, when I got my MFA, I was going to be like David Sedaris. I was going to write funny little essays about my life, only to discover in writing them that I hated doing that and that I didn't like writing about my life. But I loved history and I loved learning about it. And it felt so important to me. And it helped me through my students or through my studies to see the world in a different way, which is why I started doing this pop-up museum of queer history. There was actually a queer history show at the Smithsonian. It was a show of portraiture called Hide Seek. And there was a piece in it by an artist I loved that was pulled because of a conservative protest. So I had this idea, what if we created our own museum just to see what it was? So it started off as a one-night party in my apartment. We called it the Pop-Up Museum of Queer History. 30 people made exhibits and 300 showed up.
So cool. Are
It
you
was
serious?
shocking. We had no idea. I mean, I didn't know what was going to happen. I was just curious to see what it would be like, you know? But then also 14 cops showed up and they shut us down at midnight. And at that point, people started saying, you need to keep doing this. When's the next one? And I thought, oh, I guess this is what I'm doing now. And so that's how I got into doing this historical work, was through doing community events where we all came together to see what we knew and could teach each other and what we could create, our own venues, our own spaces. And that led directly into doing this work because when we started this, when I started this, I was in Brooklyn and a group of us got together to start doing more of them around the country. And we kind of got a model together where we did local shows based in local history. So we came back and we were like, we're going to do Brooklyn's local queer history and it's going to be amazing. But something very different happened. Everywhere else, you know, in Philadelphia or in Bloomington, we put out a call for proposals and all these people wanted to share their local history. In Brooklyn, we put out a call for proposals and all of these people went, huh? There wasn't a lot of known queer history. Little things. People said Park Slope in Brooklyn was a lesbian neighborhood, you know, but they didn't know when it had started or why or if it had ended or if it was still going on. And I started to think, wait, I don't know anything about the queer history of Brooklyn. Oh my God, I have lived in the city for decades. My family is from the city. I've studied women's studies. I worked with queer youth. I don't know anything. And this is always where my interest really lies. If there is something where I'm like, Brooklyn is a significant city that we are interested in the history of in the current present time of, and queer history is significant, how can there not be anything at that intersection, right? And that's where I find myself most interested. A place where I think, oh, I should know something. And I don't. And so then I dig in. That's where I think, okay, maybe there's something here worth exploring. And so that's how I started writing. I got a grant from the New York Public Library to research the history for an exhibition. And they said to me, when you are done doing this research, you should have a book proposal together. And I was like, oh, I'm writing a book. That's why I got this degree in nonfiction, not to write personal essays, but to write
Wow.
history. And that's how I started.
Well, I'm glad that that's the way life went for you. That's the left turn it took, because this is great.
Yes, absolutely. And you know, as we already said, like reading this book was very heavy. There are some very painful stories in this book. But for those who haven't read this book, can you highlight some of those stories for us, for people who are interested in learning more about the Women's House of Detention?
Absolutely. So for me, actually, when I was doing that research on Brooklyn, I found a couple of people who passed through the House of Detention or the Women's Court, which was the courthouse that was connected
Mm-hmm.
to it. And they are the ones who first drew me to this subject because I wanted to know what happened with the rest of their lives. One in particular was one of the earliest trans men I could find who really seemed to think of himself the way we today think of a transgender man. His name was Big Cliff Trondle, though in the Brooklyn book I couldn't find out his first name. And he was arrested in 1913 for wearing pants and smoking, you know, things that are terrible crimes.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
Awful crime.
interestingly,
Awful.
awful. I mean, just obviously a sign of moral turpitude.
Absolutely.
Interestingly, though, when he was arrested, the magistrate said, This isn't a crime. The only crime in New York state law is wearing a masquerade, quote unquote, while committing another crime. So the magistrate lets him go. And his social worker immediately picks him back up again and has him rearrested under a fake new crime because the social worker and the new judge that they get are convinced
Mm-hmm.
that any quote unquote girl wouldn't dress as a man unless she were perverted in her morals. And so, even though the
Right.
law has nothing to do with what he's been arrested for, they send him to prison for 3 years. 3 years for wearing pants in a bar in Brooklyn, right? And in prison, he's young, he's naive, he's maybe 18 or 19 the first time he goes in. And that's where he quickly becomes addicted to heroin. He's the only non addict in the cell block that he's on. They also
Mhm.
teach him to turn tricks. He ends up out of jail as a sex worker and a heroin addict, and he's in and out of jail for the next 30 years. He tries to kick repeatedly. He tries to connect with his family who
Oh,
don't
wow.
want a connection with him. And eventually, in 1942, he was found murdered in a hotel right by the House of Detention. And the other sex workers in the city took up a collection to preserve his body and get him a burial plot in a cemetery in Queens. And I was able to find all of this through these social work files. This is history that we usually get told that, one, either it doesn't exist, or if it does exist, there are no records to prove it. And if those records do exist to prove it, well, they're not from the point of view and they don't capture the feelings and emotions and thoughts of the people. But that's just not true in a lot of cases. There's a lot of places where we just haven't done the looking to find these records. The House of Detention was a 12-story maximum security women's prison located in the heart of Greenwich Village for most of the 20th century, where famous people like Angela Davis and Andrea Dworkin and Ethel Rosenberg were held, right? This is a central story in a central location to queer history, and yet it is largely forgotten. But the records I use to tell this story are at the New York Public Library, and they've been there for 40 years. This is a story, a history that is hidden just below the surface of our world. And that shocked me because I didn't know almost any of this when I went into starting it.
Yeah.
That's the really strange thing for me reading this is when you revealed what the Women's House of Detention is now, and it's that beautiful garden that you have also sat in, and I had no idea that that was a women's prison or the foundations of a women's prison prior to becoming this what is actually a beautiful garden to sit in
Yeah,
if you want to read a book.
it
And
seems
so
Right.
that was really
unimaginable.
eye-opening for me. Yeah, I had no clue at all. It was not on my radar.
All these hidden histories
Yeah, and
just right in front of
Yeah.
our faces and we don't even know.
I was super lucky because a person, an activist in New York, Jay Toole, who had been formerly incarcerated there, she leads tours of the West Village to tell people about this history because she literally specifically said to me, because the young people today don't know. And her and
Yeah.
her world is being forgotten. So thankfully, being in
Hmm.
community allows me to see this, right? I'm a community historian. I try to listen to the people who I want to be writing about and for. And Jay is the one who really told me. So if folks like Big Cliff and Mabel Hampton, who's a black lesbian
Mm-hmm.
dancer who's arrested in 1927, I believe, on a setup for prostitution, like many of the folks in the House of D,
Yep.
fake prostitution arrests over and over again. These folks really led me to this history, but Jay Toole is the one who connected it to the present moment for me. I mean, she's a Stonewall veteran
Yes.
who is an activist in New York City who helped change all of these policies in New York, and she led this tour that told me about its history and its connection to the present. So you had asked about, the stories of the people who brought me there. It's the stories that really tell me this history and through which I try to tell this history because I think it's people that matter, right?
Mm-hmm.
The House of D is just some stupid building, but its effect was
Exactly.
that it connected people in certain ways.
Yep.
Yeah. Yep.
Yep.
I think that like community history is incredibly important. Sorry, I have terribly bad
Oh
allergies.
no.
Oh no, it's okay. I'll live. But community history is really important, and I think it's especially important in somewhere like New York City, which is like this living, breathing, organic beast that's continuously changing. And from when I lived there for like 5 or 6 years, I live up north now. Up north, I live in like Westchester.
Oh, we're in Westchester.
I live in Putnam. I live in Mayapack, so
Okay.
I sit right above Westchester. It's just easier to say Westchester, but I think I was out for like a couple years before I went back because I was just busy doing things up here. And I went back. It's like, you could leave for 6 months and come back, and it's a whole different place.
Hmm.
Wow.
And to lose, and so it's not strange for me to hear that you've lost history and how much history gets lost and buried, especially in a place that changes. And I think everywhere time is changing so quickly now. So
Yeah.
people doing the community history work like you are really, really important. And one of the things we sent you a whole bunch of questions. So like talking about all these women and their stories, and was there anybody who really impacted you that like you took home, whether in the book or not in the book, that just really touched you personally, that you had a really big connection to? Because there's a lot of people in here, and their stories are similar
Hmm.
and not similar, and they're just really moving.
Yeah, there's one who's always remained in my head as this sort of like fantastic mystery of hope. Honestly, a lot of these stories are sad. It's just the nature of writing about prisons. But there's a woman in the earliest period, Louise. She's arrested as a young teen runaway. She's a black woman from Brooklyn. Her family was kind of precariously middle class. Her father was a composer who had trained in France, but he died young. Her mother owned the building that they lived in. She took in boarders to kind of keep them together. But Louise was unhappy. She was running away from home very often. She was brilliant. She spoke multiple languages, English, French, Spanish, Italian. She loved opera. She wanted to be a stage star. These things that were largely impossible for black women at that time. She very specifically says, I don't want to be in comedy. She wanted to be a Broadway dramatic actress. There had only at that point ever been one black actress in that kind of dramatic role on Broadway, right? And it was the year that Louise gets arrested. So it's an almost impossible dream, right? But Louise doesn't
Mm-hmm.
give up. She and her girlfriend steal a bunch of rare books and try to sell them. That's how they're trying to make some money. It doesn't work out. They get arrested. But Louise speaks to the psychologist that she's sent to because they want to call her a psychopath, right? They're saying that she has psychopathic tendencies because she's poor and stole some books. And so the psychologist actually starts talking to her about Wagner and opera and is shocked to see Louise as this like very intelligent, very motivated young woman. And he's like, there's nothing wrong with her. Right. So he keeps her out of the asylum where the prison system and her mother wants to be sent. And she kind of muddles along. She gets a job when World War II comes around in defense contracting, and she moves out of the city to Connecticut, and she disappears from the files. But years later, one of the social workers asks another psychiatrist who Louise was seeing, she asks the receptionist, do you ever hear anything from Louise these days? And the psychiatrist says that Louise saved up enough money during the war that she was able to move to France, which had always been her goal because her father said he would take her to France one day because there, in his words, colored people were treated fairly. And so that was her goal. And that's the last I could ever find of Louise, a ship manifest going to Le Havre,
Mm,
France, that said that she would be there indefinitely. And I love to imagine
Oh,
that in France she was able to pursue her dreams of being a stage
absolutely.
artist. They're just
Absolutely.
it opens the potential, and you don't hear that story in the 1930s very often, especially not for a young black teenager. And so knowing that story and knowing that she was able to get what she wanted, to go where she wanted to go, and I don't know if she ever got to be on stage, but seeing that has always stuck with me as a note of hope.
It was, and that's how it felt while reading the book. Just that hopeful moment, light at the end of the tunnel. And it was nice to kind of be in the position as a reader to imagine something bigger, something more beautiful, something more peaceful for this particular person. That was really, really nice to feel as the reader. Were there any other stories that you could not include in the book?
There were so many. I mean, honestly, for every person in the book, there's dozens that had somewhat similar stories, but not as well told. Basically, the way that my process works is that I sort of swim in the data for years and years and years, 4 years, 5 years, 6 years, and I assemble what is kind of like a skeleton for me. I sort of understand what happens by looking at the mass of people. I can say, okay, in the 1950s, we're clearly seeing drugging happening in the prison. The people in prison are being drugged. So there's a history here that starts in the 50s that I have to understand. Once I understand that history, then I go back into the mass of people and say, what one or two people are best described to walk us through this history? Because I can't remember anything unless it's enfleshed. I have to see a person experiencing it. So every person that I've picked is representative of 10 or 12 or 100 or 10,000 others who had somewhat of a similar story but didn't get told quite as well. So in the 1950s, for instance, there are two sisters from Puerto Rico who show up only very briefly in the records. One of them is arrested and sent to the House of D. She tells her social worker that she has a sister who is very similar in age, who is also a lesbian, but whereas she was arrested, her sister was declared mentally insane and sent to an asylum. And so their two lives diverged, and we get a little bit about them in the files, but the sister who's arrested very quickly leaves the social work scene, so her file ends, and I never even found out the name of the other sister. So I wanted to tell a story about what happens in prison versus being in an asylum, and they were an option for telling that story, but instead I went with two other people, Anne and Serena, who were not as closely connected, but did have similar arcs to their lives, and they both ended up in asylums. So in those kind of cases, it really comes down to whose story is best for the reader to explain the larger thing. So for almost every story I have, there are like a half dozen women who I'm like, oh, that file was only 10 pages, or it tells half the story but not the full story. So sometimes I feel almost like a sense of guilt, to be honest, to all the people whose lives I haven't told. It was hard. I have a spreadsheet of hundreds of rows that are just entries of women and trans men and non-binary folks and what happened to them and what quotes they have about the House of D and how long their files last for and when they were born and how they died. And I just go through them and pick out which one best tells the story I need to tell.
Yeah. Wow, that's incredible.
I can be a little obsessive about research. I often say that writing is like the way that
that's good.
I like excuse my research addiction.
I mean, it definitely shows, and it's good.
Yeah, it's more than good.
I mean, this was meticulous. You could tell this was meticulously well researched, and I appreciated it.
Good. Because I feel like if I don't understand it, then like how the heck am I going to let anyone else understand it? I have to understand 1,000 times more than what I write in the book to make sure the book like is situated in the right place, and connects to the right things. Like I had to learn about abolition in order to understand what I was seeing, and all these other things. I had to learn about the history of the drug war, and I had to learn about probation and what bail was, and there was just so much that I have to understand, because otherwise I feel worried that I'm going to tell a bad story or accidentally make people believe things that aren't true.
Yeah. I mean, I want to talk about the pants thing, but since you've brought up abolition and bail and all that, let's jump a little into that, and I'm sure we'll circle back to pants at some point, because this whole pants thing, it just throws me every time. But in the discussion, you discussed the fails of our prison system. You say prisons have very little to do with justice or rehabilitation. If they did, we would care about the 83% recidivism rate of people currently incarcerated in state prisons, or we would be up in arms about the fact that 200,000 people are sexually assaulted while incarcerated every single year, and that's not even counting those who are violated by the routine procedures of healthcare in the prisons and jails, and those who never report being assaulted out of fear or shame or simple recognition that the system does not care. The prison system is irredeemable. These detention warehouses are stopgaps and pressure valves for every system that actually is broken, from education to mental health care, and without fundamental change, any minor reform to the prison system is simply overwhelmed over time by that reality. Can you discuss the conditions within the House of D, and how they kind of relate, to the historical differences between how men and women are imprisoned, how men and women end up in the prison system? Because there's women are treated very differently. Yeah. There's a big policing of women's bodies and their behaviors that isn't seen historically with men, of course. So
okay, I'm gonna take those in pieces, and if I forget parts, remind me, because I can go off on a tangent and then have no idea where I started. So we'll start with the treatment of people in the House.
Do it all the time.
The House of D, I mean, like most prisons and jails, once we put people in them, we tend to want to forget about them. So the House of Detention was almost always overcrowded, underfunded, dirty, violent. The food was disgusting. The intake procedures were themselves violent, but also
Yeah.
just cruel and useless. One of the things that is shocking when you dig into the prison system is how little we know about the effectiveness of what we're doing. One of the places that was really
Mm.
driven home for me was that for the entirety of the existence of the House of Detention, upon entering or leaving, women were given these really invasive internal searches, cavity searches for
Oh
contraband.
yes,
It is
yes.
an awful, awful trait in the prison system. Still to this day, this is still done. It is violating. It amounts to state-sponsored sexual violence. It scarred some of these women internally and many of them mentally. And this, in the 50s, 1958, there's a riot in the prison, and they bring in a new warden. The prison has been open for like 25 years at this point, and he tries to do a thorough study of what's happening in the prison. And he notes that those searches for contraband over the last 25 years, thousands of people every year, multiple times, have never, not once, found any contraband. Not once, right? And yet it is still done. It's these kinds of conditions that take the prison from being just cruel, which of course it is, and violent, which of course it is, to
Hmm.
Kafkaesque, to being a system that does not make sense. And that, now I'm going to try and connect us back to the other part of this question. That is where I started to realize that I did not fundamentally understand what was happening in our prisons. I thought they were bad, right? I have always been a progressive. I come from a Democratic family. If you had asked me before I started doing this research, I would have sort of naively said, prisons are bad, they're broken, they should be fixed. But when I looked at this and I started to see that what we were doing had no correlation to what we wanted to get done, and when
Right.
things were found out that should have affected the way services operated, they did nothing. The way that the system remained impervious to change in liberal administrations and conservative administrations, I started to say this doesn't make any sense, right? It has to be doing something else because something else is dictating how it operates. If everyone inside the system, both those in the administration and those subjected to it, plus the social workers outside, plus frequently the New York State and city governments are saying these are problems, but nothing is being done, then the system is doing something else. This led me in two directions. In the sort of future direction, the end of the prison into today, it led me to think about abolition through folks like Angela Davis, who was incarcerated in the prison and wrote about the House of Detention and how it was essential to her thinking about abolition, because abolitionists were the only people who looked at this system and said, it is doing something different, right? There's a reason it is
Hmm.
impervious to change. And that reason is this. The prison system exists as a drain for all the other broken systems, right? If we did not have prisons to put people in who were failed by our housing system or our education system or our mental health system or our welfare system, if we didn't have a place to put them, those people would clog up all those services for the people the system cares about, who are usually white folks of some means and businesses, right? So we have to take these quote unquote broken people out of those systems so that they work minimally for the people they're intended to work for and put them somewhere else. And that is what prisons are for. It's not about justice and it is not about rehabilitation. And that putting people there is what will make the prison system always be exactly the same. Because when we tinker around the edges at justice to try and make it more fair or people to get arrested for, less serious crimes or, ways to divert you out of the system, those are all about justice. And that's not what the system is about. The system is a warehouse, right? So those tinkerings around the edges don't do anything. They have minor effects. And as soon as we turn our attention away, the prisons go right back to being overcrowded warehouses full of people who are usually poor, without a lot of people to protect them, without a
Hmm.
lot of resources, options. They are often in our country Black or POC. They are often women these days, increasing numbers of women. And in women's prisons, 40% of them identify as LGBTQ. And that holds true in detention centers for girls, too. 40%. I mean, that is a crisis of incarceration that we
Yeah.
are never talking about, except for abolitionists, right? Abolitionists are the ones, folks like Mariam Kaba and Andrea Ritchie and Angela Davis. I mean, these are the folks who really understand the system. So understanding the history of the House of D led me in the future direction to an abolitionist position because it was the only one that made sense with what I was actually seeing. But to understand what I was seeing, I also had to go backwards from the House of D to exactly what you were saying. Why is this system so different for women? And it led me to a sort of a shocking place. The 1870s, the Civil War, actually, is sort of where this all begins, because before the Civil War, almost all the people in prisons in America were cisgender white men, because they were the only ones who were subject to the reach of the prison system, because women of all colors and black people of all genders were controlled by families. The nuclear family, the enslaving family, the family that employed you if you were a live-in domestic, right? Those were the people who controlled their punishment and their surveillance. After the Civil War, however, those groups, white women, black men, all begin to enter the public sphere in much greater numbers. In fact, the first census after the Civil War, the 1870 census, is the first time we ask about women's employment outside the home, because we recognize that this was happening. And this suddenly meant that we needed a new form of social control, right? This system that had been about punishing the violent antisocial acts of white men gets repurposed for social control. And this happens really explicitly, right? There's a big prison reform conference in 1870 to say, how do we do this, right? What do we need to do? And their answer is what we would call segregation. That what the system needs is to separate out men from women, black people from white people, recidivists from first-timers, drug addicts from non-drug addicts, so we can target interventions at them. It's meant to be a progressive movement. But unfortunately, all the time, when we work with the carceral system without a further goal of weakening it, decarcerating it, what ends up happening is we build a stronger carceral system. So these folks, many of them intended to help the people that they would lead to getting arrested. But the system that they built targeted them for less serious crimes, for crimes that white men would never be arrested for, and then took what had been a punishment system, incarceration, and rebranded it as a rehabilitation system, which they tried to do. There were this reformatory movement, which was mostly for younger women and girls who were arrested, which created these big open campuses, kind of like what they call like the Scandinavian model these days, right? It's still a prison, but it did have rehabilitative qualities, which prisons today basically don't. They did try to do this, but largely because they were working with a system that was never intended for rehabilitation, never intended to help anyone. And yes, it had to do with justice, but more retribution and punishment than rehabilitative or transformative justice that we imagine it being today. Because that's the system that they used, we are stuck with it. And it is not purposed for what we want it to do. Instead, when it comes to women, the idea was to arrest women earlier, for less serious charges, and even to keep them for longer. They create all these new laws allowing women to be incarcerated without ever being on trial, for instance, if their parents want them to be arrested. The first wayward minor laws in the country are only targeted towards women. They make it possible, this thing called the American Plan, this like monstrous system that's established during World War I and lasts up to the 1970s, under which any woman suspected of having syphilis or gonorrhea could be incarcerated until she was cured without ever committing a crime, right? Months on end. And in the earliest part of this, before World War II, there were neither good tests nor cures for syphilis and gonorrhea, right? So women get targeted in these ways that are absolutely unfair. And here's the part that really connects us to how we get 40% of people in prison today being queer women. The prison system and the social workers who worked with it understood that women in the 1870s only had 3 jobs. This is, in fact, from the annual report of the first freestanding detention center for women in the country. They said in 1873, our goal is to remold and retrain these people so as to make them what God intended: wives, mothers, and the educators of children. It was a forced feminization process, because if you were not feminine enough, you would never be a wife, never be a mother, and you would never have a proper job, and therefore you would end up poor, and once you're poor, you're going to end up in prison. And then on top of that, if you're not properly feminine, you're going to be arrested for that too. So from the very beginning, this system understood that it was targeting women who were not properly feminine, who largely ended up being queer, and often black women, because they were assumed to be more masculine or refused sort of entry into white femininity in general. And so we get this system that never explicitly these days says that's what it's about, but that's what it does. And that's what it has done from its very beginning. And that's why, I mean, in New York State precedent, it was made explicit that arrest for sex work did not require the exchange of sex for money, and was in fact just, quote, the common lewdness of women. All you had to do was
Right.
be a poor woman, and you could be arrested as a sex worker and sent to jail for 3 years in New York. No
Yeah.
evidence, no attorney, no real trial.
Yeah.
It's yeah.
It's shocking.
It was it's absolutely shocking, and also at the same time almost shouldn't be shocking knowing everything we know about how women's bodies in particular are
Yeah.
policed
Hmm.
and how queer people are policed. And yeah, it was hard. I feel like at some point I did reach out to Naomi and I was just like, I'm fairly certain I wouldn't have made it. I would have been
Yeah.
like, I would have,
For
because
sure.
I am not properly feminine enough. Like it's just, I would never have gotten there.
And
Yeah.
also when you talk about like the prisons being, this warehouse, and I'm fairly certain that if you looked at the majority of an inmate's life from birth to the point where they were in jail, you could pinpoint where the system failed that family
Hmm.
that led
Hmm.
to this person being incarcerated. And we don't want to really fix those issues. We want to ignore them. It's just easier to ignore them, and we continue to do so.
Yeah.
We
And
continue to do so.
it's shocking. Some of these cases, there was a girl who's arrested in the 1950s, not even arrested. She had been beaten by her father when he found out she was a lesbian, and her stepmother interceded. Her stepmother tried to protect her, and eventually the father tried to kill the stepmother, saying she must have been having an affair with the girl. And the stepmother, the next morning, took that girl, escaped, went to a homeless shelter, and was desperate for services. But because we have a system that only sees care coming from the nuclear family, there were no
Hmm.
services for them. She had no rights to be with this daughter. There was nowhere for them to go. There was no shelter that would take them both in together. And the system said, the only thing we can offer you is to put you on parole, as though you had been arrested. So then she's suddenly caught up in the carceral system, which then means that you are so much more likely to get rearrested later, right? Because there were no
Absolutely.
services for a young black woman who is a survivor of domestic violence and her stepmother, she ends up in the carceral system. And this just happens over and over again.
Yeah. It's one vicious
Uh,
cycle, really. We
It
don't
really
really
is.
we don't really take care of all of our people, and when those people are unable to really make a life for themselves, they just get put, you know, in this
Hmm.
curveball of madness. And once the system is put into your family on any level, it is very hard to get out of that. Like
Hmm.
once they've got you, they've got you.
Yep. And care. I mean, that is the operative word. You're so right. It is about systems of care. We should really look at the prison system as a monstrous system of minimal
Yeah.
care, right? That's what it exists.
Hmm.
It exists to give you barely enough to survive on, and that is given grudgingly and with a side of violence, right? And the rest of
Yeah.
our systems of care, the ones that are supposed to do that work, we starve them. And we
Yeah.
expect at most that you get that care through the nuclear family. But for many queer people, and also for many formerly incarcerated people, the nuclear family is not a source of support. It just, oftentimes that's either the reason you end up in prison, or when you're in prison or have come out, you're abandoned by your family. So we have a system where like the only thing that like the only system of care that the queer movement talks about regularly is marriage. And marriage is just a limited solution to this problem, right? It's not bad,
For
but it's not
sure.
enough.
Yeah.
Yeah.
For sure.
Oh, I mean, since we're talking about all the challenges of being incarcerated, both in and outside of your time in prison, can we talk a little bit about our broken bail system?
Mm.
I feel like bail and bail bondsmans and all of these are just kind of like words that exist in your world until you understand what does it really mean, and the insanity that kind of is bail and how it kind of we could get into it, but then also just like the stigma and the challenges faced by the women in the house of detention, but just people in general, queer folk in general, specifically maybe after they leave,
Yeah.
when
Bail,
they get out.
I think of bail as a great example of how our system is obviously flawed, broken, unfair. I
Yeah.
mean, bail is an amount of money you can pay so that you will get to stay home before your trial is happening, right? You won't be in
Yep.
prison or in jail. I refer to the House of D as a prison, but it was both a jail and a prison. It held people who were on trial and people who had been sentenced. But
Mm-hmm.
bail allows you to escape that cycle. So it's an easy way for people who have more money to not be incarcerated. So you have time to prepare your defense. You have time to find witnesses. You can sleep and talk to your family and get advice and change your clothes so you show up at trial under your own steam. All of those things have nothing to do with whether you're guilty or not, but they have a huge effect on whether you're found guilty, right? And it's all about who has the
Mm-hmm.
money to get out of the system. And this is actually one of the reasons the House of D was created, oddly enough. In 1907, New York City recognized that they had a real problem, a problem which continued throughout the existence of the House of Detention, so at least up until the 1970s, which was this. The police had perfected a scam that they ran on women. You would take a woman in the night and arrest her for being a prostitute, right? No matter who she was. She's out on the street at night, you arrest her for being a prostitute. You bring her
Why
back to
not?
the station house because there are no courts open. 1907, we do not yet have a night court. That's when the night court's created.
Mhm.
So at night, you're arrested, you're brought to the police station. There, what the police officer would do is take a bribe from a bail bondsman to allow the bondsman in to see this woman who has been arrested, who is not guilty. Or maybe she is guilty, but often they were not. Bail bondsman comes in and says, if you go through the night here in the jail cell, tomorrow they will bring you in handcuffs to the court, and the judge will take one look at you and see that you're guilty. But if you give me $5, I'll get you out, and then you'll get, some amount of that refunded when you're found not guilty. So the woman does that, right? Because what else are you going to do? She gets let out. The cops immediately drop the charges because nothing has actually happened, right? This way, that woman never needs to go to court, and the bail bondsman doesn't have to wait until she shows up to get his money back. So he gets his money back for her bail right then. He's made $5. He gives $1 to the cop as a bribe. That woman is back out on the streets, and they arrest her again tomorrow. This cycle continues over and over and over again.
Yeah.
It's in fact the reason we create the night court, is to stop the cops from ripping off women arrested for sexual assault or arrested for sex work. It doesn't work, though. It opens, and they just immediately move this whole scandal down to the women's court, which is established in Greenwich Village, which is why the House of D ends up there. And in fact, for as long as the House of D exists, it generates huge amounts of money in fines and bails, much more so than the average man arrested does. Women are used as kind of a cash cow by the system because it is so easy with these low-level crimes
Yeah.
to just cycle them back through again and again and again and again and just keep skimming a little money off the top every time. So bail is this just like crazy system. It doesn't make a lot of sense. And there's been all these studies that show that actually a financial incentive to show up at court is nowhere near as strong an indicator as community ties. Do you have a family?
Mm-hmm.
Do you have a job? Do you have a social worker who is looking out for you? Are you enmeshed in some kind of system? That's what really tells us whether someone is going to show up for their trial. Because a rich person who drops down $10,000 might just jet out of the country, right? Because that doesn't mean
For
anything
sure.
to them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So bail is like this
Not to
crazy system.
not
Yeah.
to mention that, depending on the circumstances and what's going on, I always think back to that Khalif Bowder story. That young black guy
The
that got
backpack.
arrested, for a backpack that he didn't steal, couldn't make bail, sat on Rikers for 3 years. Basically,
Mm-hmm.
went crazy, and he got out eventually, but then he killed himself. It's like, and you think
Yeah.
about the effect that it had on him, obviously, but also his family.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they're still fighting for the changes in the laws surrounding bail, but like that one issue like affected that person and his entire family, and there are so many other
Mm-hmm.
people that have experienced and are experiencing the same thing.
I think Rikers just saw its 14th death this week.
Yeah.
I mean,
I thought they were shutting Rikers down.
they're working
What
on this
happened with
borough-based plan, but it's a long-term and slow-moving plan. And one of the things
Yeah.
you will see all the time in jail reform is that these plans get established, but they're always like 6-year goals, and then
Right.
Wait.
they get picked apart and remade and moved around. And there's now this push for a feminist jail, which I'm like, what does that mean? Pink bars? Like,
Yeah.
it doesn't work. It's not going to happen. These, again,
Yeah.
minor reforms that do not change anything. They don't decarcerate the system, and it is is, like you said, Naomi, it just keeps happening. It is constant, and it affects not just that person in prison, but their family, their community, their school, their loved ones. It has these ripple effects that are massive. And like you were saying before, Alyssa, for people, once you have been arrested, studies show that even if you are found innocent, you are so much less likely to get employed. And if you're found
Mm-hmm.
guilty, there are in fact laws in many states that won't let you get certain kinds of licenses and hold certain kinds of jobs. We know that being employed is one of the best ways to stay out of prison. So we make it
Mm-hmm.
harder for people who have been arrested to get employed. That
Mm-hmm.
makes absolutely no sense. So much of post-prison life for many people who have been incarcerated is entangled in the prison system because one, you can't escape it, right? You're on parole, or your only option for healthcare services comes through a social worker that is connected to the prison system, all of these different ways. But also, many times, once you're out, a lot of the people in your old life don't want to associate with you anymore, and so
Yeah.
many of the women and
Yeah.
non-binary and trans folks that I studied say to the system over and over again, like, okay, if you're going to arrest me and you're going to put me through all of this, like, get me out of here, like, show me
Yeah.
somewhere where I can thrive, get me a job I can do, and a house
Mm-hmm.
and a place to live. And the system isn't interested in that. The system merely punishes you for not having those things and makes it harder often to get those things. And with fingerprinting, which really comes in right around World War
Oh yeah,
II,
that was really deep.
fingerprinting is pioneered on women arrested for sex work who immediately are at a huge disadvantage. Everybody else in the
Mm-hmm.
system, men, can say, oh no, that wasn't me. I didn't commit that crime. So the judge is now just dealing with the crime right in front of them and saying, how much should you be punished for what you've done? Fingerprinting puts women arrested for sex work at a unique disadvantage because suddenly their whole history is in front of the judge, and the judge is no longer judging them on one case, but on every
Mm-hmm.
case that has happened before.
Yep.
Suddenly, this becomes a stand-in for are you good or are you bad? And they don't think about why had you been arrested before. Perhaps the fact that a woman is
Mm-hmm.
arrested for sex work 10 times means that she is facing persistent poverty, right? That is ignored. Instead, fingerprinting becomes a stand-in for being born bad. You are a bad person, and your arrest record shows it. And fingerprinting takes off in the 1920s and 30s, and then is turbocharged during World War II. Whole swaths of industries, anyone working in any kind of nightclub, even if you were a busboy in a bar, you had to get fingerprinted. Anyone working at a plane or at a bank, anyone in schools, huge numbers of people, and women are at a special disadvantage. And it's shocking, right? Like, we
Yeah.
see fingerprinting used in a way you'd think, oh, it's a way to find the right person, right? It's a way, justice. It's going to make sure that the right person gets punished, and that's just not what happens.
Right. But
Naomi, you've been
also,
fingerprinted, right?
oh yeah, government.
Yeah, because you work for the government, so I didn't get fingerprinted for a job until I was like 30 something. And I actually was terrified. I was like, what are you going, because I don't trust the system. So you're like, what are you going to, I don't want you to know who I am because I don't want you to like, I don't want you to pin something on me or like,
Hmm.
I don't know. There's like
Oh
this
yeah.
distrust of having anybody know too much about me, identifying things about me. I don't really
I had to give up
like,
that a long time ago. I mean, in this,
yeah,
in this organization that I work for, it's not just
yeah,
fingerprinting, but it's also the 10-year background
Mm.
contacting people because I have a particular thing that I
yeah.
need to work, and
Hmm.
it's like they're all up in there, all up in there, calling the people, checking to make sure I am suited to work in this organization.
Hmm. It's interesting. You mentioned being a nurse. So many of the folks in this book wanted to be nurses or worked as nurses. It was a job that was available to them without a ton of education, and it was interesting. It was exciting. It had variation to it. There were lots of call for it, lots of jobs. But over and over again, once fingerprinting becomes a normalized process, they cannot hold those jobs if they're white. Eventually, they get fingerprinted and discovered, or if they're black, they can't
Right.
even get those jobs.
Hmm.
Fingerprinting puts these women at a unique disadvantage.
Mm-hmm.
In World War II, the moment when we're supposed to believe that there's this rising economic tide that takes us out of the Great Depression, right? But formerly incarcerated people are kept out of that.
Yeah. And I think that what was the dollar amount or cent amount that they were given when they would leave prison? And we still give people
Jaw
some
dropping.
very chump change amount of money
I believe in New York
and like a
State
pat
now
on
it's
the
forty
back and
dollars.
told to
$40 if
Oh,
you had
that'll
a
That's
get
going to
felony.
get
you.
you far.
Yeah,
That 40 is going to get you
It's gonna
so
get you
far.
super far.
and everybody has
Especially if you're
known.
coming out of Rikers right into Manhattan. You're do great.
You want to
Good
know
luck.
what I just found out in the last 3 weeks? I had no idea. I did not know, and I don't know if it's for every state. But I was looking at because I live in Virginia, so I was looking at Virginia and Maryland. But if you have a prison record, you cannot get a lease for an apartment.
There's a lot of
So,
things that preclude you from.
but you can buy a house because
Hmm.
mortgage lenders don't check, a criminal background. But how are you going to buy a house when oftentimes you can't even really get a job, let alone
Mhm.
a well-paying job that's going to give you
Hmm.
enough income to be able to afford a home?
Yeah.
And you probably have no credit because you've been incarcerated for a long time, or maybe
Hmm.
you have poor credit because you came out, at an age where you had not learned about the ABCs of building and maintaining good credit. And it's like,
Hmm.
well, what are you supposed to do? No one's setting you up for actual life when you're inside.
Yep.
So you come out at a complete loss. You're already starting in the red. How do you get in the
Mhm.
black?
Yeah. Yeah, and
You
and
don't.
nobody
I mean, it's
cares.
just
Like nobody in the system cares. The head of the Department of Corrections in the 1960s in New York said to a journalist at one point, "If I had an unlimited budget to spend on rehabilitation and those kind of services, that kind of teaching and education," she said, "I would have no idea how to spend it because we have done none of the research and we actually don't know how to
Mhm.
help anyone."
Yeah, it's clear that the system is actually set up to do exactly what it's supposed to do, which is to take the undesirables in our society, whatever they are at the time that we're
mm-hmm.
discussing this,
Yep.
and stick them somewhere and forget about
Yeah.
them.
Yep.
And that is exactly what it's built to do. It's not built to, you can put rehabilitation anywhere in your descriptors of whatever facility you're talking about,
Hmm.
but it's not built to actually do that.
And that is
And it's failing people
Yeah.
left, right, and center.
Yeah, and that is
Sorry,
no,
go
no,
keep
sorry, I
up.
just got excited and I had a lot of
That's
coffee
okay.
this morning.
That's what I do.
But that's the exact reason that the House of D, when it is torn down in 1974, why it is torn down. They say over and over again that this is the wrong space, right? It's
Hmm.
disturbing to the proper residents of Greenwich Village. It's not that we
There's
don't
that
want to
word again,
support these
proper.
people. Yeah, that comes up all the
All
time.
those people who
Yeah.
don't wear pants.
But they're not supposed to be here, and they're the ones causing a problem. Even though prisons are constitutive to Greenwich Village, they have a longer history in Greenwich Village than almost anything else, right? But the rich folks
Hmm.
who own the land don't know that history, so they make up this fake history where the prison has been inflicted upon them, and these people shouldn't be here. The plaque on the
Mm-hmm.
fence in the garden that was the prison, all it references are how, people would come and yell up to these women day in and day out, and it was a disturbance to the residents nearby. And so they move them to Rikers, an island where you can't get there very easily, and certainly no one can see them. There can be no signs of support. You can't hear the women up above.
Yeah.
The women in the prison, they rioted repeatedly in the 50s, the 60s. They participated in the Stonewall Uprising. They set fire to their belongings and threw them out the windows while chanting "gay rights, gay rights, gay rights." And you can't do that on Rikers Island, right? And increasingly,
Hmm.
this prison closes right as our modern system of mass incarceration takes off. But one of the things that happens is you see all of these prisons opening in further flung places, these little isolated towns that have no other economy. So they depend on the prison for their survival. So they need it to be there. But that place
Hmm.
is hundreds of miles away from the families and communities of the arrested people inside. And so that's another way in which you were saying earlier, Naomi, that does violence to those families and communities. Think about the money and the time you have to spend to go see your loved one in jail, or you don't get a chance to, and then they are alone and they have no contact, right? Like this
Exactly.
Hmm.
system requires hiding what it is doing because what it is doing is so bad and is about hiding. It's not
Yeah.
an accident. It is central that we move these prisons out of our cities and as far away as possible.
Yeah, they don't want any societal witnesses
Hmm.
Mm-mm.
to the disgusting, sick and perverse things that are going on
Yep.
in those jails and prisons. They don't want that.
Yeah, and we're moving further and further towards all kinds of media, making it harder. There's a new law to make it so that you can't even get a letter written directly to you. Instead, the letter gets scanned when it comes in, and you get like an electronic copy. So you don't even get like the paper, the physical,
Wow.
something you could put in your cell. I mean, in all these ways, we are trying to make a permanent underclass, right? To say that these people,
Hmm.
once you have been arrested, you should never be allowed out of this group again.
And I think and on top of all that, you have to remember that in most states, these people aren't even allowed to vote when they come out. So you can't even affect change in the normal way that many of us would think you can affect change, because you can't even vote yourself out of these situations because you've had that right taken away from you.
And if you've been in prison for laws that are fundamentally unfair, and you're the only person who understands how unfair they are because you've been through the system, and now you don't have a vote, and also no one will listen to you. And if you talk about these issues, everyone says, well, you're biased because you've been arrested, right? Not you actually know more than I do because you have been through the system.
Yeah, yeah. I do want to touch on a little bit about what queer life is like in the House of D, in the differences maybe between that and a men's prison, because that is a huge part about this book, are the the women and the transgendered people that are in these prisons.
What's really interesting is that for as awful as the prison is, and it is, they all talk about the mice, the rats, the inedible food, the violence, the guards, the cruelty, the cavity searches, all of that. For many of the people who are incarcerated there, they found community through it, because this is the weird thing, right? The period the prison is open, like 1932 to 1971, spans what I think of as the most homophobic time in American history, because that's when what it means to be gay has been defined, and it's spread throughout the country by World War II. We get all this education of sailors and soldiers and people on the home front about homosexuals as a threat to democracy, and they're going to give secrets to the enemy, and they're psychopathic, and they're pathologically disturbed, and so all this information gets spread. The 1950s, super conservative. We get all these bar raids, right? You can be arrested on the streets for wearing pants. You can be shut down in a bar. Private residence
pants. I can't get over the pants.
The pants is ridiculous, and you don't even have a right to privacy. So you can be arrested for having gay sex in your own home, but the prison cannot be shut down for queerness because the government is the one putting the queer people there, right? So the prison is unique, and I think really helps Greenwich Village to maintain and develop its queer reputation, because literally the government is putting thousands of queer people in the center of queer life in New York City throughout the most homophobic time in America. That's why we have dozens of lesbian bars that spring up in that area. And these women and trans folk and non-binary people use the prison to make relationships. They meet people inside, they pass information, they stand outside, and they watch people come in and out. Jay Toole, that woman who I mentioned earlier, told me about how when she and the other butches were not in the prison, they would hang out at Whalen's, the drugstore across the street, because it had a soda fountain and a payphone, and you could watch for people that you had met in prison going in and out. And when I looked into the history in the 1930s, butches were doing the same thing in a different pharmacy in the same spot, right? They were waiting because they knew this was the one sort of landmark. All of these famous lesbians in New York City history talk about it this way. Audre Lorde writes about it as one up for our side, right? A pocket of female resistance. Joan Nessel, the co-founder of the Lesbian Herstory Archives, writes about how central it was, how it was a beacon and a warning at the same time, right? Inside the prison, many, many, many folks had their first understanding of their sexual desires or their gender identity, or the first chance to put those understandings into practice if they already had them in their heads. We don't know, because these kind of statistics were never kept, exactly how many people identified as queer in the prison's history. We do know the system focused on queer women and improperly feminine people, and estimates in the 60s say about 75% of the folks in the House of D were queer. 75% in the years leading right up to Stonewall. And the Stonewall Inn and the prison were 500 feet away from each other. The people on the inside saw and participated in everything that happened. They were part of the Stonewall riots. And the folks, we don't know the names of most of the people who were in the prison that night. We do know two of them, though. And those were Afeni Shakur and Joan Bird, two of the leaders of the Black Panther Party, who were both queer women. I actually got to talk to Joan Bird's girlfriend, who she met in the House of D, who told me, or not Joan Bird, sorry, Afeni Shakur's girlfriend, who she met in the House of D, who told me all about how when she got out, Afeni Shakur worked to connect gay liberation and the Black Panthers, to knit these two really important 60s movements together. And so much of that was through the moment of the prison. After Stonewall, the first queer rights organization that gets founded to sort of focus that energy, it's called the Gay Liberation Front. And they specifically get founded because folks at the Stonewall riots wanted to protest the Women's House of Detention in support of the Black Panthers. And the older existing gay rights groups did not want them to do that. So they formed their own organization, the Gay Liberation Front. And their first protest was back at the House of D. And they were there over and over and over again until it got shut down. The House of D was a terrible place, but it was a center for queer community, activist community, personal community, sexual community. It was a meeting place. It was central. I don't think you can understand New York City's queer history or the history of Greenwich Village without understanding how central the House of Detention was.
Why is this Women's House of D really kind of not really written in the history of Stonewall?
I mean, that is a great question for whom I think the only answer is misogyny, right? There have been...
I think that answers a lot of questions.
Yeah, absolutely. But there have been women trying to tell this story. Arcus Flynn, who's one of the members of the Daughters of Bilitis, did an oral history that you can watch online today, right now, after you listen to this, where she talks about driving through the West Village, coming home from her job as a nurse, and seeing these little lights falling through the sky and getting out because she didn't know what was going on, and hearing the women chanting about gay rights. And that's how she learned the Stonewall riots was happening, right? She's been talking about this since her oral history was taken in the 80s. Rita Mae Brown, the author of Ruby Fruit Jungle and all these other really important books, she has been talking about it since being there at Stonewall, right? She has said the women in the House of D held a riot all their own. And I believe in a write-up for Dignity, the Queer Catholic organization's newsletter, she wrote, the reason this story never got told is because men were the ones who wrote the histories, right? Jay Toole, who was a Stonewall veteran, has been telling this story for decades, right? But there are so many folks who did not get listened to. And then on top of that, huge numbers of the people in the House of D, even if they were queer, were not connected to the official queer movement in any way that recorded their stories very well. So their stories exist, they can be found, but that first level of queer history researchers who did incredible work, I do not want to fault these people. They built a thing that we can build off of, right? But they didn't know how to find these stories. They didn't even know these stories were there to be found in many cases, right? So I think that it is a practice, right? We're always undoing what we think we know about history as we learn more. And I think the hardest part is to just accept that. I think so many people right now are having a really hard time, particularly cis white gay men who are older and increasingly lesbian women who, for instance, don't want to hear about the trans people who were really formative to the Stonewall riots, or to the early queer movement, or particularly don't want to hear about Black trans women who were formative to these movements, because that's not the history they have grown up with. And when you grow up with a history that you have to fight to get even a small piece of, it can feel really threatening for someone to tell you what you know is not the full story. Right? And so people try to protect it. They try to hide it away as though that's going to make it better, rather than opening it up and saying, yes, what I learned is part of this history, but there's more to it, right? And we can get a better and bigger picture by opening to all of this history. But that's scary, and it's not what we learned. And we're taught to see these things as a fight, right? That it's constantly like, was it gay people or was it trans people? Never to see it as a community as a whole. And,
like, could it have been everybody?
Yeah. And that's what Jay Toole says about Stonewall riots. She says the reason that Stonewall mattered when all of these other incidents didn't is because it was everyone. Everyone was showing up.
Yeah. I'm just going to jump to this because I'm very curious about this. There was a pregnant lady in Alabama recently who was put in prison to protect her unborn baby if she possibly smoked weed or something like that. And it just struck all the chords of the Women's House of Detention. And I was just wondering if we could talk about this a little bit, because it seems like we can't escape anything. Like, everything that's old is always new again. And, with the changing environment now, with the rolling back of Roe v. Wade, and I think there's a growing modesty movement, at least online. I spend a lot of my time on YouTube and watch a lot of commentary stuff. And there's a lot of commentary against the modesty movement, but this whole evangelical modesty movement thing. Do you see are we pulling back to kind of like a House of D era, or am I being very bleak in my outlook of the world?
I mean, I don't think you're wrong. I don't know exactly what's going to happen. I always say I know a lot of the past and not very much of the present. But I do think that you're right, that so much of our carceral system, when it focuses on women, sees women not for what they have done in this moment, right? It goes back to that fingerprinting question,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
for who they are essentially, and who they are to the system is often a threat to men and a threat to the system,
Mm-hmm.
right? So a woman who is a sex worker could have a disease which they could pass on to a man who's supposed to have a job or be ready for war. And so we have to attack women for health reasons and incarcerate them, not because it's illegal, but because it might hurt men. Right. And we get that
Mm-hmm.
again with birth, too. So many women are arrested or incarcerated for drugs, for alcohol, for the way they behave, in this idea that they will pass their criminality on down to their children. Right. That's the big fear. That's a big part of this kind of eugenics movement, which is the idea that
Mm-hmm.
all personality is rooted in your body and you pass it down very
Mm-hmm.
simply to your children.
We could be here for like
Yep.
hours if you want to talk
Oh,
about eugenics.
this is all caught up in eugenics, all caught up in eugenics, right? And we do over and over again return to this idea that more important than a woman is whatever is passing through her uterus or could potentially pass through her uterus. That is, in the eyes of the law, essential. And we're starting to get these
Mm-hmm.
fetal personhood laws, which are ways to reinscribe that into the system. We had
Yep.
it in the
Mm-hmm.
older system without writing it down in those ways. It was just,
Yeah.
how you were treated. Women were simply arrested. You had syphilis, well, then you should be incarcerated, right? Now we're reinscribing this into the law by writing these things that are theoretically about, protecting children. But it's only so long as that child is physically connected to the woman that we're interested in protecting it. And that, I think, tells us a
Yeah,
lot
yeah,
about
yeah.
what the
Then
law is
forget it.
really doing. Again,
Yeah,
Exactly.
the law frequently has nothing to do with what we're told it has to do. And that is a
yeah,
big reason why the system has remained so impervious to change. Because if you distract, it's like a magician, right? You do the flourish over here and the trick over here, and everyone's eyes are up here, and you never change what's actually going on.
Absolutely.
I think it's a really hard pill for people to swallow to realize. So, like, I'm a recovering Republican. I grew up in a very red family. It's been a journey, but there's like a lot of like rhetoric and stuff that you just kind of accept without really looking any deeper. And once you start to look deeper into things and have that like self-reflection and doing the hard work that nobody really wants to do because now you're challenging everything you ever thought,
Mm-hmm.
the world looks very different. And I'm not saying that everybody's going to end up being some like crazy left wing liberal, but like when you start looking at like things from a humanistic point of view and you start seeing how certain things in our world are set up to sort of erase our humanity and to disconnect us from community, so that we just follow some sort of, set of rules to further somebody else's agenda.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I think the world just looks different. You start to just it's you want to change stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think there's so
Really
much to
quickly.
unlearn, not just the specific politics of being Republican or Democrat, but like,
Yeah.
aren't we grown to think, oh, you do the time for your crime and then you're done and you're
Mm-hmm.
innocent. But we don't treat people that way. That's not
Mm-mm.
reality. We have this idea that we have a justice system, but so little of it is about justice. And these things are bedrock. They are beyond Republican or Democrat. They are what we are
Mm-hmm.
taught as sort of like just a naive understanding of our own political systems and our own world. And I think those are so hard to unlearn because even people. So one of the questions I get asked a lot when I talk about abolition is, but what about violent crime? Right? What do we do about
Yeah.
violent criminals? Which on its surface sounds like a reasonable question, right? Nobody wants to
Mm-hmm.
be the
Mm-hmm.
victim of violent crime. And what I say to those people
Yeah.
is, let's unpack that for a second, right? When you ask me what about violent crime, what are you afraid of? You're afraid that that person will commit another violent crime and do violence to someone who doesn't deserve it. But we know that when we put that person in prison, we put them at risk of being sexually violated. We put them at risk of being assaulted. We harm the community they come from. We make it more likely for them to commit a crime again. We make it more likely for them to have all those kind of invasive searches. People who are in prison often get hooked on drugs or involved in other kind of criminal activities that further damage them. Their families have to spend so much money. And if you are right and that person does commit another violent crime, well, being in prison doesn't stop that. It just means it's another
Yeah.
incarcerated person upon whom that violence is inflicted. So when we ask that question, we're actually asking the wrong question. That question presumes that certain people deserve violence and certain people do not. But the people asking that question are not thinking about it that way. That's not at all what they intend. In their minds, they're asking, how do we make people more safe? Because that's what they've been
Mm-hmm.
taught, that prison is about their safety. And in certain ways, it is, if they're the kind of person who's never supposed to end up in prison. But that safety for some rests on increased violence for others. So if what we want is less violence in the world, the question is not how do we incarcerate people who've committed violent crimes? It's how do we undo this system that is not helping us and is in fact inflicting more violence on everyone. But the people asking that
Yeah.
question, that's not what they're thinking about. They're not wanting to see people hurt. They're not disregarding the humanity of incarcerated people on purpose. It's just what they have been ingrained in them, liberals and conservatives, that this is a
Mm-hmm.
justice system that protects people and reduces violence. And those things simply aren't true.
Not
I
to
think it's
mention,
easy.
I'm sorry,
Sorry,
not to
go,
mention a
Naomi.
lot of times, a nonviolent person oftentimes goes into prison, and then when they leave,
And
they come out
comes.
violent just because of the nature
Mm-hmm.
of that environment. And then when you ask that question, oh, okay, well, I'm worried about these people committing crimes. And if you really start peeling back layers, and again, if you go back throughout their history,
The
what
system's failed
points
them
of
somewhere.
system failure put them in a position where they felt like they had
Mm-hmm.
to commit a crime? Like, we can't discount that either, because that's
Mm-hmm.
a
Well, there's
very
never.
important part of that story.
I
Yeah.
don't know if we could ever create 100% like perfect anything for any system, but there has to be a better system for
Yeah.
people who like. I think when people think about violent criminals who deserve to be in prison, they're thinking like Charles Manson. Okay, so like they're thinking people that go out and do like crazy, horrible
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
things. And like, sure, should there be a system in place to handle that level? Probably. Is it this one? Probably
Mm-hmm.
not. But not everybody is Charles Manson. Like, and like Naomi said, there's points along the way where other systems have failed. Everybody from just the poor kid who maybe was selling some weed because he doesn't
Mm-hmm.
have any freaking money and needs lunch money, who's now in jail,
Mm-hmm.
to your serial killers. There's a whole spectrum of people, and the system has failed them all
Yeah.
at various points.
And so much of what we need are upstream solutions, right? Like I think so much of
Mm-hmm.
decarceration is actually about asking exactly those questions, Naomi. Where did the system fail them before, right? And how do we fix that? How do we make sure that someone doesn't end up at this place? Because this place, our society, our system has no other recourse, no way to deal with these people. And so we need to fix those kind of upstream solutions while also like I'm not against reforms, right? I just think that they have to always be done with a goal of reducing the system because
Right.
otherwise
Mm-hmm.
in the end they'll make it bigger, right? So we do need those
Yeah.
kind of reforms. We do need to make small changes, but we just have to have incremental goals that get us to the right places. And so much of those are these kind of like upstream and other solutions. And also, I think going along with what you were saying, Alyssa, not only do we have this range of violent crime, but I think we often, those of us who have not been incarcerated or who are not close to this system in certain ways, exempt our own lives from an understanding of what crime is when you're in the system, right? Who has, like, I know many people who've gotten into a stupid fight at a party and punched somebody. Is that great behavior?
Mm-hmm.
No. No, it is
Right.
absolutely not. But they're not arrested for it because it happened at a frat party at a college campus that was really ritzy and expensive to get into. And so the cops do not have access to it and nobody reports it to the
Mm-hmm.
police. Or even if they
Mm-hmm.
do, it's reported to campus safety. So those
Yep.
people don't think of themselves as having committed a violent crime, but they have, right? Or you steal something from a store, but you also have a knife on you at that time. You may never have brandished that knife. You may never have even intended to use that knife for that theft. But when you are caught by the police, it is found in your pocket. And now it is proof that you intended a violent crime, right? In all
Yeah.
of these ways, people getting arrested all the time with, 3 shots of heroin on them. Well, that's intent to sell. Is that intent to sell, or
Yeah.
were you just,
Is it?
right?
Maybe I just wanted a good time. Like you have no like. I hate the intent to sell. Unless you're walking around with bricks, I don't think you have an intent to sell anything. But that's a whole different
But so many people, I
conversation.
think, misunderstand when people are arrested, they do jump to that Charles Manson place and don't ever think about how
Yeah.
their life might look if someone were looking through the lens of the criminal system.
I mean, I went to, before I became a nurse, I have a bachelor's in biology from Franklin and Marshall. And at the time that I was there, I think in our freshman year at a frat party, I think it was our freshman year, but very early on in our period there, somebody had been sexually assaulted at a frat house, which is not an uncommon occurrence, multiple times, like in a night, like she got drugged Nobody did anything about it. So there's, multiple gentlemen who, and I'm using that term very generously, who assaulted a woman. Nobody did anything. To this day, I don't believe anybody has ever had anything happen to them. And the only recourse that ever happened was a publication that went out basically by the time we were graduating, where one of us wrote an article just shaming the school. And that was the only recourse we got, was this like moral recourse of being like, shame on you, shame on you for covering it up. So then there are thousands and thousands of stories like this of people that walk around, like you were saying, that have committed crimes that if they had been caught, they would be wrapped up in the system, and they're not strictly due to their own privileges.
Yeah.
And
some of those are intensely violent.
Discourse. Yeah.
And awful. And some of them are, I mean, I know so many people who've driven while intoxicated, right? Smoked weed when it was illegal, drank while underage. These are things that if you're the wrong kind of person will get you into the system forever, right? But if you're the right kind of person, nobody will do anything. No one will say anything. It will be a joke. It will be something you tell people and laugh about, right? And that tells us something really essential about the system, I think. That it is not, again, about justice.
Certain people are meant, it's okay for them to do things, and other people it's expected for them to go to jail.
White people, rich people, men, cis people, straight people, those people are allowed to do things.
I would include like white women in there too. I feel like white women get kind of, and I have this as a question. There's like, especially if you talk about the feminist movement, and when you erase intersectionality from that, there's a lot of white women who have failed the rest of of women.
When I put out those identities, I think of them as circles, not as like a singular one, but it's like what the circle of white people, the circle of men. Like within that, you have differentiations, but those are.
I just want my fellow white women to know that they're not without
to get called out.
Like, just so you know, you're not without some blame for some things.
There's this great
we do owe some people some things.
There's a great theorist from the 70s and 80s. I mean, she's still around today, Gail Rubin, but she wrote this article called The Charmed Circle, and it's all about. She's talking about sex, but she talks about like these are the identities which are in the charmed circle. You can still, like, if you only have one of them, you can still on other parts end up outside the charmed circle, right? But any amount of being in it sometimes means that what you do is excused or is seen as okay, where it's that. So it's like, whiteness and maleness and straightness and healthy bodiedness and all of these things. But you're exactly right. Like white women, there are gay people who do terrible things in these systems, right? Like nobody is exempt by their identity from being on the wrong side of this system. The system, in fact, frequently wants people who are going to stand up and say, I am of that community, but I reject the idea that the system targets my community. I am going to support the system, right? Those people get promoted all the time. We want those voices.
Absolutely.
Because they're validating voices for the system, which is, your system's flawed.
Yeah. Also, there's also a thing about whose life do you value? So who's that lady that wrote Know My Name? Chanel Miller. That whole case. That judge looked at that young white man and thought his life means something. His life has value. We don't need to really punish him for, a few seconds of fun. But had there been a black or a person of color, there's no doubt in my mind that that person would be under the prison today. So it's also about like the lives they value and the lives they don't think has any worth at all.
Yeah, and who is seen as capable of growth, change, worthy of rehabilitation, whose mistakes are seen as mistakes, and whose mistakes are seen as constitutive of being a bad person.
Yeah.
You get very little grace in this country if you are black or poor or a woman or a trans person. It's little failures.
And the more of those boxes you check, the less chances you get.
Absolutely.
Honestly.
Yep.
It is. We need a cheery note.
I know. I was going to say, wow, every time I talk about this, I'm like, I'm so sorry. But at home, your listeners are like, I have to turn this off now.
I need a shot of tequila and a warm blanket.
Look, we said it's heavy, but like, I still feel like everyone needs to read it. And I know like this current political climate with, people trying to, challenge and ban books, it's insane. God. But I think the world would do justice if this were like required reading for like 11th, 12th grade and, college. I really
So
do.
speak
Thank you.
so speaking of required reading, and I agree with you. So you'll know where this is. So I was in Hugh. I was in my local book barn at my library buying books because I sell books for $1. It's the
Hmm.
greatest place in the world. And I overheard this conversation. Somebody was buying history books for her son, who is a teacher in Chappaqua and teaches history, where they have now said that they cannot teach the Holocaust and
What?
slavery, maybe, or they have a lot of rules around it. This is Chappaqua. This is an incredibly, for anybody who doesn't know what Chappaqua is an incredibly wealthy and presumably liberal
Hmm.
town outside of Manhattan. And that just floored me. I stopped and interjected myself in that question. I was like, of all the places in Chappaqua, they are not doing this. This is how far that this has reached, is into our public schools in like incredibly liberal towns in the blue state of New York. We are.
I just don't know what we're gonna do. I mean, this is really. I'll admit, I didn't think this would still be going on, but this started really getting out of control. What, like a year and a half ago? I
Hmm.
honestly didn't
Mhm.
think it would still be picking up the amount of steam that it is. I'm a little shocked, to be honest. I kind of thought it would settle down. I guess I thought that the public outcry would
Hmm.
be in such mass that they would kind of like, cool their jets a little bit. And so
Yeah.
the fact that it's just like it's going stronger and getting heavier than ever, I don't I don't know
I
what we're
think I
supposed to
think we've
do.
underestimated the power of certain lobbying groups and other sort of more grassroots
Yeah.
I mean,
political groups and stuff.
I think that we've had a series of Supreme Court acts that allow more money and make, voting less and less real. And then on top of that, we have an increasingly polarized world where,
Yes.
like states are going in different directions, families, it's becoming harder and harder to talk about these issues. There's no shared
Yeah.
conception of anything.
That's so
I
true.
Mm-mm.
agree with you, Naomi, that I often, these days, I look at the news and the politics and it is very hard for me to see a world where it comes back together without some kind of
Yeah,
cataclysmic
radical
event.
change.
Yeah. I mean, it
Yeah,
just seems like we are moving towards a system where people like disagree about fundamental basics of how to have society or what are
Yeah.
what we are, and how do you reconcile that? And
Exactly.
it doesn't seem like it's happening.
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, we're a very young country. And I think this is happening not just here, but like I think, we all live here, so our thoughts are very centric to the US. And we're very young, and
Mhm.
a lot of countries have gone through a lot of turmoil throughout their aging process. And I'm very curious to see what all of this is gonna, and also not curious. Like I kind of scared, but like
Yeah.
where this is going. Has your book been banned or challenged yet?
Not that I know
Because you
of.
hit on a couple things that people don't like,
I'm
namely
very
queerness.
lucky. No one wants to read a gay history book. They have to read it to ban it. You know what I mean? It's like they don't pick it up. They want something that's fiction or a comic book or mine doesn't have, queer in the title. It's in the subtitle. And these people banning these books are I mean, I hate to be so blunt about it, but they're very stupid and they rarely read. And so
Yeah,
they are
They
only
don't even read
picking
the
up,
book they're challenging or banning.
yeah.
yep,
They're like, there's two gay penguins in this book, and they're raising a baby. Okay,
It's
well, they're
just
raising it
it's
in
darn
was probably a
insane.
more healthy relationship than you have. So shut
Ugh,
up.
it.
it's so
These,
upsetting.
and they're penguins.
Yeah. And
It's
it's very
ridiculous.
hard. I try not to go to a World War II Nazi place, but it's very hard not to think about connections to
It
Weimar
sure is.
Germany, where the first, books to be burned and banned were Magnus Hirschfeld's Institute for the Study of for Sexuality Studies, right? Like
Yeah.
this has
Hmm.
happened before, and of course this isn't. I always say I don't think history like exactly repeats itself. It's not a circle, but it is a spiral. We come back to the same
Hmm.
place
Yes.
at a different moment in time. And I'm
Hmm.
worried. I'm worried about where we are right now. It's scary. As someone who
As
does
am
this
I.
work, I also
Yeah.
work on curriculums for the city social studies department, and watching these panics about groomers and about banning, queer history in state curriculums and libraries. It's hard for me not to worry that exactly what you're saying, that someday my name is going to end up on one of these lists, and what happens after that?
Yeah. Have you read this to, because you mentioned that one book? Have you read The Hidden Case of You in Forbes?
No. What's that?
Okay. It's about this trans man in Scotland, I believe, that in around the turn of the 20th century, and he got to live his life as a trans man up until his brother died, and then there became an issue of inheritance for a title, and then that just like spiraled out of control, and really brought a lot of the politics around being transgender in like the 20s and 30s to light. And it's really fascinating. You might really enjoy it.
Yeah.
It's a really good book. It came out like last year, I think.
The what of Ewan Foster? The mystery.
It's a hidden case of Ewan Forbes.
Ewan Forbes. The hidden case of Ewan Forbes. Thank you. I'll check that out.
Yes, check that out. It's really fascinating. Just how, because I feel like we have these pockets where you can kind of see how we're trying to get a slightly more progressive society somewhere with different topics, and then something happens, and then it just falls off.
Yeah.
It's
always nothing is a straight line of progress, right?
No, and then you got to start building back up, and that was like that book really touches on that one moment, like around because there were a lot of doctors on the continent, in Switzerland and Germany and stuff that were working with transgender people, and all kinds of different intersex and all kinds of things, and there was a lot of work being done, and then Nazi Germany kind of comes in and
kind of gets in the way of everything.
Kind of gets in the way.
Yeah. I just got this new book, which I'm so excited about. No More Police by Andrea Ritchie and Miriam Cava. Oh, I cannot wait to read it. I'm so excited. Both of their previous books I've loved, and so speaking of how do we undo this, and I think that this is going to be a really great resource.
Yeah. So we're coming up on your hard stop, Tammy. Do you want to do our little like we'll try to lighten it up. End of show stuff.
Yes. So we like to ask our guests, what are 2 old books you love?
This is so hard because I panic every time somebody asks me about books, and I'm like, have I ever read a book? And also...
we all do that. We do that. We give recommendations in every episode. I'm like, Naomi, I'm staring at my shelves, and I feel like I've never read a book.
Yes.
What am I recommending?
Yes. And then on top of that, I read thousands of pages of really boring stuff all the time because I'm reading annual reports, and I'm reading, so to keep kind of close to the topic, I did a little thinking about it. So these are 2 books that were really important for me as I was writing The Women's House of Detention or learning about it. So one is Angela Davis's autobiography. I cannot recommend it more highly. It is a fascinating look written in the moment, right? It's only a few years after she's been arrested that this is written. It's while all of this stuff is still being fought out. It has a lot about the Women's House of Detention, but just in general, it has a lot about politics and the government and abolition and the prison and police system. There are parts of it that I don't like. She even says in interviews now that she is very uncomfortable with the way she discusses particularly masculine women in prison. But it was very of a piece with the Communist Party at that time, which she was a member and leader of, and of the left and of everyone, right? Like it's the same homophobia that everybody had. But the book is fascinating and so smart and so relevant to today, and such a good inroad if anyone is interested in reading about abolition or reading the rest of Angela Davis's books, because she has written so many fabulous books. So that is like one absolute favorite that I highly recommend everybody check out. It's so good.
Okay.
And then if you want some fiction as another option, there's this book called The Swashbuckler by Lee Lynch. It's not very well known today, but it's a not memoir. It's a roman à clef. It's a novel, but about like butch femme bar life in New York City in the 1960s and 70s. The House of D is in it. It's a really great look at that moment, that we rarely get told from the perspective of someone who was involved in the bar scene. And Lee Lynch is wonderful, and she's still around, and she talked to me as I was writing this book. And so those are 2 books that if you're interested in learning sort of more about kind of the 1960s moment and the prison, they're very different sides of it. Neither one of them is specifically about the House of D, but both kind of mention it and pass through it. And I think both are really worth looking at. And Angela Davis's autobiography just got reissued, and Keongi Yamada Taylor wrote a great kind of like review and think piece about it in the New York Review of Books that is really fabulous and came out, I think, last week.
We're going to have to pick both of those up. Okay.
What are two like debut or newer novels that you have read and loved?
Oh my God. My friend Alejandra Varela's new book, The Town of Babylon, is fucking amazing. It just came out a couple months ago, and yesterday it was put on the long list for the National Book Award, one of 10 books.
Fantastic.
Yes.
Ooh.
So I cannot recommend it highly enough. It is absolutely fascinating. It is really funny and smart and weird and dark, and he has a great voice. He also writes a lot of short stories. So if you like him, you can look up his
Okay.
stuff. I love him. And then the
It
other
has to be
one,
good because that was the most genuine, fucking amazing I've ever heard. Like that was.
it's just so good. It's so good. And he just got the National Book Award long list, so I'm very excited for him. The other new one that I read, this is a year and a half ago, so not quite so new, but Mariam Kaba's "We Do This Till We Free Us," I think is like an essential
I read that.
abolition. Oh, isn't it so
I
good?
just got it.
Yeah, it was really mind blowing actually, and really eye opening because abolition is something new for me. So I'm kind of
Mhm.
like delving into that topic to
Same.
learn more about it. But it was
I
very
think a
well
lot of us
written.
have lived in the
Yeah,
rehabilitation world. Like
yeah.
let's kind of fix it. Let's
Mhm.
rehab it. And
Mhm.
like sometimes you just literally need to gut it. Like
Yeah.
Yeah. And her
Also,
book is
that's a
so
book you need to
brilliant.
read a few times.
Yeah. But it's like
Mhm.
little pieces, it's like, okay, a
Yeah,
5-page chapter, and it's so like smart and yet easy to read at the same time. I find
absolutely.
often the smart things that are really smart and say something that is new to me that I need to learn are written in a way that's very hard for me to read. And her book, I was like, oh my God, this is brilliant, mind opening, and not
Yeah,
difficult to read. And that just is like
exactly.
the fact that she can do all three of those things is amazing. So
It's a
another really
welcoming
great
book
one.
if you're new to that topic and you want to learn more. It's very like, come on in, let me teach you a little bit about it. Yeah.
I
Yeah.
love it.
Mm.
Anyway, I'm just
Wow.
realizing that we're asking people to recommend 6 books. That's a challenge.
Oh, wow. Okay. Well,
That's all right.
what are two books that you think everyone should read?
This one is very hard because I'm like, what is a book everyone should read? I just, so, like I go through it, I flip through them in my head, and I'm like, I don't know, what is an essential book? And then I start to fall apart, and I'm like, what even is a book? What is reading? Why do we do this? Um, but so these, I tried to think about this for a long time, and it was very hard. And so I landed instead on ones that were essential for me to read that I hope maybe, but these are books that I read a long time ago, so I also understand that maybe that was essential for me in 1997. Who knows if it
Right.
is for people today? But This Bridge Called My Back, the collection of essays from the 1970s, which was put together by Gloria Anzaldúa and Sherry Moraga, is incredible. I think it is like, if you want to understand intersectional feminism, pre Kimberly Crenshaw even coming up with the term intersectionality, This Bridge Called My Back is just a phenomenal book. And one of the things I love about it is that it moves between genres. It's got some nonfiction, it's got some fiction, it's got some poetry. Maybe it doesn't have fiction, it might just have nonfiction and poetry. But it is really just an incredible book, and was so mind altering for me when I encountered it as like maybe a 19-year-old or a 20-year-old. So that's one that I think everybody should pick up and read. I think it is amazing. And similar, and a book that I encountered basically at the same time in my life, is Close to the Knives by David Wojnarowicz, which is another book of essays about his sort of personal experience growing up as a queer man in the 60s and 70s, being a sex worker on the streets of New York City by the age of 13, becoming HIV positive, but also becoming a leader in the AIDS movement, a phenomenal artist. Just he really, truly, his work, I think, is so fascinating and intelligent, and again, moves between genres. He's got poetry, he's got essays, he's got paintings, he's got sculptural pieces. His work is incredible, and there's a ton more out there about him. He's getting more and more well known. And when I mentioned that piece of art that was censored that prompted me to
Yeah.
start the Pop-Up Museum of Queer History, it's actually a film of David Wojnarowicz's. So those
Okay.
two books, Close to the Knives and This Bridge Called My Back, for me, were just essential texts in understanding the world. And so if I had to recommend two books for everybody to read, it'd be this.
I
Interesting.
love it.
Very good.
I love
Very
it.
good.
All right, we gotta wrap this up. But 2 quick questions, which might not be quick. I don't know.
I'm
If you
long-winded.
could write a letter, yeah, so am I. If you could write a letter to your 17-year-old self, what would it say?
I would just list the winning lottery tickets for that $1 billion Mega Millions. I don't have any
That is
advice. I just
That
think that
is
a
the
little more
best
money.
answer and the most honest. Everybody says give something esoteric, but no, that's what you
Yeah,
need.
some
It's a couple
practical
billion.
steps. Like, here's $1 billion, and don't fuck it up.
This is how you change a tire, and here's
Yeah.
$1 billion.
Yeah.
What
All
are
right.
two things people can do to help the prison abolition movement?
I think get involved. I mean, I think that's the first thing. Is so much of life today is atomized and tells us not to leave your home, to be on the internet, to talk only to the people you're already talking to block, anyone who criticizes you. And I think that the abolition movement needs people to come to it, to be involved, to go to protests, but also to go to learning sessions, to listen and to read and be in community and talk to each other, and to then bring that lens to your life. To ask yourself, abolition isn't just about going to a protest outside of a prison. Abolition is about the concept of justice that we operate under, right? And justice is something that exists in all of our lives. We're constantly trying to figure out how to make the just decision, the right decision. And I think that abolition can be a lens. Transformative justice can be helpful in so many aspects of our lives. So I would say show up and educate yourself. I had to do a ton of reading to understand this stuff. It's not
Yeah.
normal. It's not what we're taught. And I think, frequently these days taught to see abolition as this pie in the sky, ridiculous goal that's going to make
Yeah.
Democrats lose. When I think if you look at it
Yeah.
the right way, it's like a floor, not a ceiling. It's the basement of our demands, because these other systems that are broken that we need to fix. So long as the prison system exists as it does and police exist as they do to funnel people into it, we will never have the impetus to fix those systems, because they are being inoculated from their own problems by the prison system, right? So
Yeah.
we are never taught that. That's not the system of justice we think we are operating under. So we have to learn it, right? We have to read a ton of stuff and listen to people who know more than we do. That was so much of my journey, was just listening first to the people who had been incarcerated in the House of D, and then as I began to understand their issues, listening to the people who had written and been thinking about these issues for decades. Most of my writing comes from a place of ignorance. I'm trying to learn something I don't know because I think I should know it. And so
Yeah.
that's what I would say. If you want to be involved in the abolition movement, get involved in abolitionist organizations and do the reading, do the homework, do the listening.
Yeah. It's okay to be ignorant. It's just not okay to stay ignorant. You
Yeah.
have to do the work to figure stuff out. We can't all know stuff. Abolition movement is not just like opening the doors and being like, "See ya,
Yeah.
bye."
Exactly.
There's more to it. It's not whatever scary soundbite gets thrown around to counter the arguments. And most of, I think, what we deal with politically is not just the scary sound bites.
Yeah.
There's real people and things that are happening underneath all of that. And
Exactly.
you got to do some work to get to the heart of it.
Yeah.
Exactly. Oh my goodness, Hugh, this has been wonderful. We cannot thank you enough for agreeing to come
We're
on
so
the
excited.
show.
Thank you
Again,
too.
the book was phenomenal. Everyone needs to read this book, please. I
Read it with a friend so you have somebody to like
you're gonna want
decompress
to.
with.
You're gonna want to. She and I were just back and forth in our chats. Like, did you read this page yet? Did you read that part yet? Can you?
There was some point at the end where I was like, Naomi, I don't know if I'm just now desensitized or if it's just like not as hard to read now. Like, did I go through like enough trauma in the beginning of the book that by the end I was just kind of like numb?
Yeah.
But
I don't know.
It was a learning lesson, and I feel like it's a very important book. So thank you for all the hard work that you put into it. It was well done. Well done.
Thank you both for reading, for chatting with me, for coming up with great questions, for doing this, and for getting more people to read just in general, which I think is so essential and wonderful.
Yeah.
And I have one small favor to ask of your readers, which is just if you like it and you don't mind reading me or leaving me a review, wherever you leave reviews, it does make a difference. Makes people buy books and check them out. So thank you.
Absolutely.
Yes. Yes.
All right. Well, thank you again, Hugh.
Thank you. And enjoy the rest of your Sunday. Thank you for doing this at 9 a.m. on a Sunday, which is like, oh my gosh, I feel like I should send you flowers and whiskey.
All right. So, what book are you recommending to the people today?
I'm recommending Never Let Me Go by Kazuo Ishigaru. That's closer to right. I don't think it's right, but it's closer to right. Every time I think I'm getting closer. Every book I read of his, I think I get a little closer to being able to say his name properly. This is my second. I've now read 3, and I have my 4th book that just arrived when we were orphans. So I'm going on a bit of a deep dive in 2022 into Ishigaru. because his writing is just so absolutely wonderful. And I feel like I've talked about this once before here, and I'm gonna do it all again. And I don't apologize because I don't care. You're gonna have to sit through it because he's amazing. So there's a reason why he's like a Nobel
Yeah.
Prize winning author. Every book of his is so distinct in the character. I mean, you can tell that it's his writing, but every character is distinct. Every poor Naomi's neck. Every story is so different. Every character has their own unique, genuine voice, and he really is a master of writing. And this was a very interesting book. So I feel like people don't talk a lot about what this is about, and there's a reason, because it has lots of little twists and turns, and it is a little bit gothic because there's stuff going on, and you don't really know exactly what's going on. So you meet these children in this school, and it feels like a very special school. These are very special children. They are being taught for something special. They are here to be groomed for something special. And there's a lot of discussion about stuff sort of, there's all these like kind of weird, I feel like everybody doesn't want to ruin something about this book, but basically you're trying to figure out the entire time exactly what is so special about these children. Why are they being taught this way? Why are some of these teachers just crying all the time? And they seem very sad. Some of them are very strict. What is it about their art? And there's a lot of art and writing and creative processes that are being taught. Why are they being taught these things? What happens once they leave this institution that they are being groomed for? And it's a very interesting look at humanity. I can see how things from here have been brought into Clara and the Sun, which is always interesting. I love an author with a deep backlist, because you can see how earlier works get reflected again in later works. And how they might explore a similar topic or theme again. So it is really, really good. And I'm sort of learning, because I'm also currently reading How High We Go in the Dark. And I'm learning that there's a very special pocket of sci-fi and lit fic that really, really, I don't know, it just does something to me. And this kind of skirts on those edges too, is there's this literary sci-fi area where you are really sort of big braining it. It's not just like a more fantasy style sci-fi where you're like off in space fighting space wars. It is a sci-fi that's looking at humanity. It's a sci-fi, a futuristic, a strange, weird world looking at today, or talking about today, or talking about very grounded things for us now, and not just some sort of odyssey. And I really love books like that, like Sea of Tranquility, How High We Go in the Dark. This sort of skirts on those edges, and I can see how it goes from here to Clara and the Sun, because Clara and the Sun, I feel like, fits into that. You know, you're in this weird tertiary place that is outside of our time, but it really does talk about our time now. And yeah, so I love it.
Interesting. Okay.
I love it.
Wow. All right.
Sorry.
I'm going to read the
I
reviews.
hope you enjoy my decongestant high reviews.
I love it. I love it. So, I am recommending today The Other Westmore, One Name, Two Fates by Westmore. This is really a pertinent recommendation after the conversation we had with Hugh Ryan. So this profiles the author Westmore and another gentleman in Baltimore also named Westmore. And it's really the story of their two lives and how either one could have been the other Westmore. Oh, wow. So the author, Westmore, really had a great academic, career from grade school, all the way through college, and really did well in life. I believe he's currently running for the governor of Maryland. And then the other Westmore, who had just a series of points in his life where the systems failed him and his family, and he ended up doing something that, now he's in jail for life. And it's laid out so well that you can really, as the reader, pinpoint where if this person had have gotten this chance, he probably wouldn't have been able to do this, or would not have gotten involved in that situation. And it's sad yet hopeful, but it is eye opening so that you understand that lack of resources and lack of support can really be the downfall of a young person. And
Yeah.
I just highly recommend The Other Westmore, to One Name, Two Fates.
I mean, I think that one of the things that maybe we didn't explicitly say in our interview, but was very much implied, is that there is a flaw. Sorry, Siri, we're not talking to you. Uh, is that there is a serious issue in our social services and our mental health services.
Yeah.
Particularly in the US, I think that there are lots of places that have this problem. It's not strictly unique, but we are very good at being bad at things.
Yeah.
We are uniquely positioned to be very bad at things, I feel like sometimes. And if you had a more robust social services, uh, mental health, community-based services that really look at taking care of the humans and people and their needs and trying to meet as many of those needs as possible, the basic needs that people need.
Yeah.
Food security, housing security, just feeling safe, and not just like physically, like mentally safe. There's so much that is lacking, and when you fail people, especially when they're really young, you can fail people at any point in their lifetime,
Right.
but when they're really young, it's I feel like it's so impactful on the overall trajectory of their lives. So uh, just putting them in jail or is not enough of an answer. Like, that's just like putting something in the closet and closing it and being like, yeah, okay, it's gone, it's fixed. It's not fixed.
Absolutely.
So yeah, this is I just loved our whole discussion today. I think that it brings up a lot of questions. It points people hopefully into a lot of directions of where to maybe learn more, and maybe pulls
Yeah.
back the curtain on certain things. So
And
that,
hopefully it causes people to question some of the things that are going
yeah.
on that really aren't serving us as America as a whole.
Mm-hmm.
You know, hopefully this was an enlightening conversation where you begin to really think about things that are happening, and you think about the plights of other people,
Yeah.
you know, and grow some empathy and some understanding.
Yeah,
Hopefully.
hopefully. Well, hopefully
Yeah.
you guys enjoyed. We really enjoyed it. This
Yes.
was and thank you, Hugh, for coming and talking to us and for working with
Yes, you
our
were such a
schedule
delight.
and all of that. We've
Yes.
actually
Thank
loved
you.
it. So,
Yep. Anyway, that's going to do it for us. We are out of here. Bye.
bye.